Hey guys, so after spending a couple of months working on NextJs, which is a full stack web framework built on reactJs, from which you can build both front end and back end applications. Still, for me, I consider that sort of a front end web framework. I came up with some do's and don'ts that you should consider if you want to take a full advantage of using Next.js. By the way, before we go on number one, I would say the number zero you should take into consideration is that you should know React. You should have a basic foundation with React if you really want to take full benefits of using Next.js. In my humble opinion, I believe Next.js is one of the fastest clients, quote unquote clients, a web framework that I've ever encountered. So the number one point, if not a consideration that I wrote down while I was working with Next.js is that you should, and I know this is a must do, all of us, the majority of developer that they have spent time with Next.js, they know that is that you should wrap the server components over the client components. The client components render on the client side, or whether the server components, is rendered, using the server side rendering, as we know with Next.js. There is a pre-render before getting the response from the server. So that's the number one, is that a server component should wrap the client's component. Let's say you are using cookies, right? Let's say you wanna get static data from or a response from a server. Let's say cookie. So it will be better for you to just get the cookies from the clients, from the server, and then they inject the response, if not the data, on the useState, if not the client's components. That's number one. So number two is that if you are dealing with three or more use states, it will be better just to use useReducer. So what do I mean by that? Let's assume you are dealing with these sort of states. We have the is logged in states. We have as error states. Instead of using multiple use states and kind of like making your code really cumbersome, it will be better to just it will be better to aggregate all the states to one states, and by that you'll be using the useReducer. As you can see with the useReducer, we aggregate all the states in one state, which will be the logging state. And within logging state, we're gonna have as an error, which will be a boolean. We have is logging, which will be also a boolean. And instead of using a different state for that particular value, we can just dispatch a name as an error. If there is an error, if an error is propagates, we can dispatch as an error, and the dispatch will sort of encapsulate, if not abstract, all the contents for that particular state to update the state. Okay. The third one, which is a don't, is that if you are dealing with more branching states. By branching states, I mean, let's say you want to update a state X, but there are some conditional for you to update that state. For instance, we have if X less than C, set states C plus 1. Else if condition 1 or condition 2. So as you can see, we have to call setState multiple times, by branching states, which means that we can only update states with some conditional data or some conditional value. So if you are dealing with this sort of scenario, it's just better to use useReducer. You know, as you can see with useReducer, instead of branching, using different branching, we can just make it much more simple. We can if C is greater than X, dispatch is greater, and then we can abstract all the codes or the data relating to that specific branching. Okay. Next, number 4, for me, I believe useRouter is heavier than Windows location. useRouter is heavier than Windows location. As you can see, I finished with question, which means it's optional. It depends of the situation. There are some situations where it would be better for you or for us to use Windows location if you are dealing with much lighter, much smaller data or states on your use client components. It's just better for you, much more convenience to use a Windows location instead of using a useRouter. Okay, but if you are having sort of a lot of data where instead of using useState, you are using useReducer, and then you are dispatching data left and right, I would recommend that we can use the router, the user router, and then update our location using the router push. Okay, but I believe since the Windows location is abstract, is encapsulated by the useRouter, it's just better to use Windows location over useRouter. I'm not saying useRouter is useless. It's not useless, but Windows location is much better. As you can see in our instance here, in our case, we just use effects, and then we pass the branching. If C, then location, and then updates the history, But alternatively, you can also use useRouter, but it's gonna make it heavier because you need to run the use effect inside of useRouter. Okay. Next, we have the globally mutated variable. In JavaScript or any other language, there are instances where you need to mutate a variable globally. So what I noticed is that it's better to use a globally mutated variable on the server components than using that on the client's components. Why? Because on the client components, we manipulate or we update states using utilities such as useState or useReducer. So if you are dealing like let's say you wanna update a component based on some or dynamic components. Let's say you wanna create dynamic components. You may use you may initiate or declare a global variable, and then update those global variable accordingly so you can generate client components. As you can see in this instance, we have a variable var, and then we can update the variable var with CL, and then when we get the value of the CL, and then we inject the value on the client's components. So it's always better to use the globally mutated variable on the server components than using the other client components, which allows you to get the full benefit of server-side rendering. So you render everything on the server side, and then you inject the results on the client's components. Number 6, only cache static data. Don't cache everything. As we know, by default, NextJs caches everything. So you can now, as you can see in this instance, we have the fetch utility that's posting, but while it's posting, we pass the property cache no store, but we revalidate with 2 minutes, which is 120 seconds. Okay, so we revalidate in 120 seconds. If you post with revalidation, you will stay there. You will keep posting the same things and the data will not be updated. So you can only cache static data. If the data will be dynamic, like a post is a very powerful verb. It's not idempotent like the get. So you don't need to cache that. You don't need to use revalidate. But in terms of a verb such as get or any idempotent verbs, you can revalidate. You can cache that so you can increase performance. So don't cache everything, even if with the NextJs, by default NextJs we cache everything so you can server-side rendering and pre-render. You don't have to cache everything. The last one is refactor and refactor. I cannot talk about anything except without pointing out about refactor. JavaScript is with JavaScript things can get really cumbersome, really fuzzy. So it's better it's better to refactor. Let's say for this scenario, for this instance, we want to find in array if one of the value is false. Instead of looping through each value and then find if one of them is false, we can just use a utility from prototype sum, and then we find if one of the value in the array is false. So refactoring JavaScript makes sense. It's really useful. So I will recommend that you always refactor your code. So that's all. It was a pretty short video. I wanted to point out things that I noticed. There are a lot of things that I noticed while working with NextJs, but I wanted to point out these if not 7 or 8 factor that is so important. So to recap, I will say don't cache everything, only cache static data. Use globally mutated variable on the server side. Number 4, use router, use Windows location when possible, because use router is heavier. Trust me, it's really heavy. Sometimes it's just gonna hang a little bit before it respond. So it's better for you to use Windows location via use effects. Number 3, when you're dealing with a lot of branchings, useReducer is much more flexible and performant than useState. So for me, I would recommend. Okay, here is the things. You can start with the useState, but when things start getting really crazy, you can switch all the data from useState to useReducer.